I think that there's a couple of major problems that typically happen. So definitely the most common one is kind of what we talked about at the head, which is that you either, A is maybe you don't use customer proof, right? I think that's a mistake. I think the way that buyers make decisions today is definitely influenced by that. So if you have no ability for someone to find customer proof, that's a mistake. And I want to clarify here too, I've used the word customer proof a few times. Note that customer proof is kind of the umbrella term I'm using for testimonials, reviews, use cases, right? So all of those are kind of under it. So you should use some type of that to make sure that you're helping people really understand your application and it's coming from a customer voice. So I would say number one, obviously, is not using it. If people are using it, there's often like just a couple quotes. I've seen the little conveyor of like a very basic quote, and there's no face to it. Sometimes there's not even a role to it. So it just says from John Smith or from, whatever name. And it really, again, doesn't build confidence. People read that and it's kind of like a throwaway. Of course, if someone says amazing platform and, they're like, okay, that's kind of like a meaningless thing. So I think make things not having specificity, lack of customer proof, a lack of using proof across different mediums. So you actually asked a really good question earlier when you said, what channel should you use this? What other channels should we use this? I've been amazed sometimes when I find a video on YouTube that has, 800,000 views, but they're not using that on their website as an example, or things that are vice versa. So you see there's these huge opportunities to say, look, if you have a really powerful piece of content, make sure that you're repurposing it across your key channels to maximize bandwidth. So if you're starting out and you're like, a lot of businesses, especially again, because I spent a lot of time in B2B SaaS, and to be candid, B2B SaaS tend to be kind of bad at it. Right? So when it comes to use cases, people tend to have use cases that are like fairly generic, that use like stock images that are, they might get into, SaaS is typically a little bit better about getting into the specifics and the numbers. So most of the use cases I review do that. But the overall tone of it tends to be very stale, tends to be very stagnant. So instead, I think it's great, like when you're talking about use cases, very clear before and after, very clear like what is the problem, very clear what is the solution, very clear what is the results. So those are some pieces to think about when you're designing use cases, like literally call it out, have a section, right? Have a section, the problem, have a section, the solution, the results, right? So that if someone's reading that and they're like, look, I just want to look at the data, awesome, go straight to the results. If they want to understand what the context is, they can start with the problem, etc. So thinking about pieces like that, when you have reviews, take a step back and use yourself as an example, right? Say, what kind of reviews do you trust? I know that part of what led to this journey for me was I felt like I read a lot of reviews. When I make decisions, like when I go out to eat, I look at the restaurant. When I go out for a hotel, I check it out. When I book a trip or when I book a tour on a trip, I always read reviews, right? So I knew reviews were important, but when I also went to a lot of websites, I felt that the reviews didn't have any explanatory power. I was reading a bunch of reviews. I was like, I don't really trust these aren't influencing my decision. So the question was, how do I make a gap? I know that these are important, but there seems to be a lot of misses. So I started to really take a step back and say, like, what kind of things actually have impact and power on me? And those were those things we've been talking about. Those were the specifics. Those were the people that, were giving me tangible tips. Hey, when you're connecting and integrating with the system, make sure that you do X, Y, Z, right? Or if you don't have this, you're going to need to use Zapier. Like just the things that were like, okay, that's really specific. And I read that review and it actually taught me something valuable. And then if after the person says that, they then say something like, and by the way, this platform has been amazing and it's, and it's going to have a result. They've built a lot of trust by giving me practical insight, So that's another kind of trick to this trade. If someone tells you something specific about setup or something to be aware of, everything doesn't need to be like perfectly, flower rosy. Part of it is just building trust in that kind of dynamic.
Right. I mean, it can definitely have like one or two of the points where they also say, say that this didn't work for them. But then like overall, they're sort of telling how it solved their problem in a bigger picture. And I think, obviously it can't be perfect. And if it looks very rosy, if it looks very, like all positive feedbacks, so it obviously comes across as it could be fake, right? Yeah.
And I just one other thought on that. I think that part of this is going back to the affinity of you want to be really honest with we're for X, not Y. That's a really good way you can do this because people are like, oh, I don't want to post negative stuff. But part of it is you really want to narrow in on your ICP and be on it. Like I can't tell you how many people I've seen that are like, basically their comparison that says we're for these people and not these people is pretty much we're for everyone. They're only not for people that, have no money, like they'll put in ridiculous things. I think that's a mistake. It's the same way that I train my sales team. I say, be open about your competition. Talk about them. We're in the video space. We talk about Lumen Video, our two biggest competitors, two biggest people out there. We don't hide from those companies. We just clearly state, here are the applications where it makes sense to use a tool like this, right? And here's the applications where it makes sense to use a tool like that. The more that you act that way and you openly talk about them and you openly put them out there, that's what builds trust and confidence. Now the person's like, they don't think, okay, this person's being kind of shifty, because look, people in the B2B space, especially, they're knowledgeable. They know about the incumbents. If you don't mention the incumbents, it's not like they just forget that the Salesforces and the HubSpots and the MailChimps exist, right? They know those people exist. So, and also if you just trash them, oh yeah, that's like a horrible tool. Nobody uses MailChimp. People look at that and they're like, well, that's obviously false, right? So instead you're like, they're good at this thing. We're good at this thing. And so I just wanted to emphasize that because that's a really good way that when you're talking about these kind of issues to build confidence by being a trustworthy source in your comparisons and in your use cases.